In the middle of the one-by-one process, as you saw in the video this morning, into this community from Miami-Dade has been, from our perspective at JPEF, a breath of fresh air, really doing some amazing and powerful things. Here in Jacksonville, has developed a very close relationship with our organization and with the community overall. So we're very excited to have him here. We also welcome Torin Daly, pastor at First Baptist Church in Oakland, who's my board vice chair. They're going to have a bit of a conversation to sort of get things started, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A so that everybody can have a chance to hear about what this type of work is like, what the perspective of the superintendent is about this type of work. So with that, Torin, we'll hand over to you.
So what time frame are we working?
We got till 12:30, about 40 minutes.
Okay.
And then the superintendent has a board meeting tonight, so we want to make sure we keep on schedule.
All right, well, we're going to jump right into it. Welcome to Jacksonville, those of you who are from out of town, and it is a tremendous honor for us to be hosting you here over the next day or so. I'm going to start by asking Dr. Vitti just a series of questions. As Trey noted, we will open it up for conversation. So, as I told my friend Kurt downstairs from Pittsburgh, I want you to be thinking of some questions so that when we do open up the floor for questions, we just don't hear the crickets chirping, all right? But, so let's start here. The group here is fairly familiar with the one-by-one campaign. And so the selection of you, Dr. Vitti, occurred right in the middle of the process. So when did you first learn about one-by-one, and what did you think about it?
Well, good morning, everyone. Soon to be good afternoon. I first learned about the one-by-one campaign when I decided to apply for the superintendency here, actually. A part of my thinking in going into a school district, and I think it's important for context. When I was in Miami, chief academic officer, we were obviously being highlighted as one of those urban school districts that were moving the needle, narrowing the achievement gap. And so my phone was starting to ring, I would say, over the past year to apply for superintendencies throughout the country. And I had not done that. Duval County was the only superintendency that I applied for because I wanted it to be the right match. I wanted to go to a place where there had to be a lot of work that needed to be done, but that there was an infrastructure there and an awareness that there had to be change. I didn't want to go to a school district where there wasn't a recognition that things had to be done differently. I didn't want to come in and say, we need to do things differently, and then there was going to be massive resistance to change. Then I would waste my time trying to explain the change and justify the change rather than getting to the work of making a better school district for children. So I learned about the one-by-one campaign when I decided to apply for the superintendency. I was doing my homework on the district. I was doing my homework on the community. I knew about Duval because I had worked at the state level as a deputy chancellor of school improvement and student achievement. So I knew the positives and the negatives as far as where Duval stood with reform. But I went a bit deeper. So I learned about the one-by-one campaign, and I was able to hone in on the feedback that was coming from the one-by-one campaign from the stakeholders out in the community. I actually pulled a lot of the summary data at the principal level, the teacher level, the parent level, the children, and what they were saying, and that certainly influenced my analysis of where I thought the district was and the gaps that needed to be filled, and I was able to talk through some of that during the interview process when the board was interested to hear what my vision was for change and where I thought the areas that needed to be improved going in.
Very good. What benefit is there for having a clear vision from the community? And does it carry any risks, walking into a community whereby a vision is already laid out?
I think, well, the benefit for me was a lot of the feedback that was coming through the one-by-one campaign aligned and echoed what I saw as far as the problem. So on the positive side, it allowed me not to feel isolated or someone that was an outsider coming in saying, we're going to do all these things different, and the ideas of what we would be doing differently would only come from my head and from how I viewed it. So I was able to leverage the one-by-one campaign feedback to explain the need for change and explain what change should look like and the areas of focus for that change. I think the threat comes into, and this is a complicated issue, when you're coming in and you affirm the feedback from the community, for the community or those that participated, it's a recognition that their voice is being heard, and there's hope that change will happen. The challenge becomes, are you being so dependent and are you being so loyal, and are you moving away too far from your board to say, this is recognizing the change? And that's where the difficult balance is and the threat becomes, which is, are you doing this because the community is telling you to do this, the community, or are you doing this because the board also thinks that this should be a change? And oftentimes, hopefully, what the board wants to do and what the board thinks needs to happen is in line with what the community wants. But this is when I go community, because how do you define community? Is community solely defined by the people that participate in one-by-one, or is it also other stakeholders and other entities that are in the community that may have a different perspective? So the challenge has been, or the threat has been, is as we built this new strategic plan, very much aligned to the feedback of the one-by-one campaign, and really aligned to what the board saw when many of them ran and as the needs of change, is how do you recognize the voice of the community through the one-by-one campaign and still recognize that the change and the reform is also aligned to what the board is seeing as the change. Does that make sense? It's that balance. I think that's the threat.
Well, let's work on that a little bit, even more. So, because this is a group of local education fund leaders, and so what advice, what suggestions would you offer those who are contemplating a grassroots movement so that the community's voice is as representative as possible and is respected as such by the elected officials?
Great question, and it's always that difficult balance. I think in any reform process, I think you start with engaging the public officials, the leaders of the organization, to state, we're seeing this as a problem. We may or may not have the solution, but this is what we're seeing as a problem. And why don't we work together to try to engage the community on the solution? I always think it's important to go to the policymakers first. And I think that's just being respectful of the governance structure. But I will say that there is a breaking point. I think if you're really committed to change, is that you engage those policymakers first, and then if they're not receptive, you have to move on to what you think is best for children and for the community. And I think that's their approach, is first engage a policy, hopefully they're on board, and it's a collaborative process. But if it's not, or they're not recognizing that change needs to happen, and you are that confident that things need to be addressed, then move forward. And then hopefully then you continue, then those policymakers will come on board when they recognize that the movement is so strong and the voice is so strong that change is needed.
So all of this has kind of worked in concert with the development and now the implementation of your strategic plan. As you began to work on your strategic plan for the school district, did one-by-one play any role in that?
Sure. In the creation of the strategic plan, the new one, which we'll be actually implementing in 13-14 and building our current budget off of, was we looked at, first of all, the board and I went through a SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats as far as the district was concerned. We also took the feedback from the one-by-one campaign. We looked at, there was a process called the envisioning committee, or envisioning committees to pick the new superintendent. So we incorporated that. I had 7 town hall meetings when I first started as superintendent, which ranged from every sector of the community so they got to know me, and I heard from them. A lot of the feedback that came from those town hall meetings were very much aligned to the SWOT analysis and to the one-by-one campaign. So as we went through the development of the strategic plan, we went back and looked at the feedback from the one-by-one campaign with what were the issues and what were the solutions, and tried to reflect that in the strategic plan. We also used the JPEF to help facilitate the vetting of the strategic plan, the proposed strategic plan, through a lot of the stakeholders that participated in the one-by-one, because I thought it was a win-win. On JPEF's part, it was, well, we need to allow participants to see that what they offered as feedback was being reflected in the strategic plan. And for me, it was also an opportunity to allow them to see, hopefully, how they could put their shoulder to the wheel of then implementing the strategic plan and participating in the reform moving forward into the next school year. So it was a win-win. And so that we tried to merge the two through the development and the vetting. And then we're hoping to culminate that this summer by what we're calling a pep rally, which is highlighting the strategic plan by each of our 4 goals, and then allowing the community to come to that pep rally and see what the implementation of the strategic plan will look like by the 4 goals, very much aligned with the one-by-one, and incorporating them into the implementation. I don't want the community just to be a part of the creation of the strategic plan or the input of it, but actually the implementation, especially on the community and parent and caregivers area of the strategic plan.
Dr. Vitti, if you would, please identify perhaps the top 3 things that we did here in Jacksonville to help you not feel constrained by the one-by-one process, this grassroots process. What were 3 things that we did that allowed you to embrace it and feel very much so welcome to be a part of it?
Great question. One, participation. I didn't feel, once I was named superintendent, I never felt that JPEF was moving forward with the next steps without coming back and saying, Mr. Superintendent, where do you stand on this? How can we best structure this to align to where you want to go and where you're seeing as the problem? So the key, my number 1 is communication. And that's always hard to do when you're running fast with a sense of urgency and change. But I really felt JPEF did a good job of coming back and saying, well, this is what we want to do, this is how we're looking at it, are you on the same page? And then negotiating with not losing, not watering down the reform, but negotiating the next step so that we were in sync with what things look like as far as the process moving forward. I also thought that it's important to not only engage the superintendent, but be respectful to the board, where a commitment to decisions, a commitment to the next steps also doesn't neglect the board as well. And that's more my responsibility to engage them, but to notify me with where things are going, allow me to go back to the board and say, time out, are you okay with this? And then moving forward. The other area is to be able to disagree, and I think that's important. Is that I think everyone in this room, and then whenever you go back to your district, hopefully you're at a place where you want the same thing, which is what's best for kids. And you may disagree on the specifics, but you can agree to disagree on the implementation, or agree to disagree with the next step. But you need the communication. I hate to see it when the community feels that it needs to impose the reform, or that the community or the district feels that it doesn't need the community in this kind of setting. That's when you start sacrificing children, I think, or what's best for children. And you need leadership to be able to say, we don't have all the answers and we're open to the communication, but it has to be a give and take. So I would say communication, compromise, and the development of trust. And so I would say that, but that comes with communication and having the space to disagree, but then agreeing on something moving forward.
Thank you. What do you see looming on the horizon? What do you believe is next in Jacksonville related to community engagement around the topic of education?
I think that the next step is the community seeing its involvement with the implementation of the strategic plan now. So now we have a plan. On paper, It makes sense. It's aligned with what the issues were identified as part of the one-by-one, but now where is the community involved with the implementation of that strategic plan? Is it part of the parent academy and in training parents? Is it wellness? Is it early childhood education? Is it recruiting new teachers? So everyone has a role in that, I think, somewhere. And then where is that role, and what does it look like, and is it aligned? I think that's one area. I think another area is accountability, is that as we move forward, we need periodic meetings with the community to say, we said we were going to do A, are we really doing A? And as we do A, are we seeing outcomes? Are we seeing results with doing A? So that the conversation doesn't just stick to the rhetorical or the theoretical, but to the actual implementation. And I think that starts going into next year. And then that also incorporates a continuous improvement model, that process of saying, you said you were going to do A, we're doing A, but as we do A, we recognize that there are some gaps in implementing A. And what are those gaps, and what do we need to do differently? And how can the community help in allowing us to do A better? Is it more resources? Is it additional human capital? And so that's the process of really working together with refining the implementation.
What is the local education fund's role in that? Are they best positioned as your cheerleaders, as your constructive critics, as input providing friends? How do you see, it could be possibly a combination of all of those things and then even more, but what is the most fundamental role you see as it regard or as it pertains to the local education funds?
I would say all three. I don't think you ever, as a local educational entity, I don't think it's always just being a cheerleader. I don't think that does anyone good. So I do think that there's a time to recognize improvement, recognize commitment to improvement, support the reform and the change, but never just be someone who is cheering. I don't think that helps the organization improve and build upon the areas of improvement, and also starting to recognize and admit that there still needs to be things that need to be improved. But I would always say, and I always say this, with every degree of accountability has to be a degree of support. There's nothing worse than being attacked from the sidelines, and then you don't feel like the same critique or the critic is also stepping foot on the field as well. So I don't ever think that it does anyone any good, from the superintendent to the board to principals to teachers, by just having someone on the sideline heckling and saying, we can do better, this is unacceptable. At some point, you have to put your skin in the game to say, I'm critiquing you, but I'm also helping. I see a way to assist. And that goes back to trust. If you're okay with critiquing, and I'm okay with accepting the critique because that's how we get better, then we're going to build trust when I realize that you're not only critiquing, but you're also willing to help. And so what does help look like? Help looks like, help is defined by additional resources. Help is actually getting involved in volunteering or using your organization to whatever it may be to make that a difference. But if you're only going to be a gadfly, then that's not going to change anything. That's just going to be it's going to be a nuisance to trying to move forward with the work. But if it's balanced with support, then it makes everyone better. I also think, again, the cheerleading aspect is important. Sometimes in public education, you feel public education is oftentimes, it's very susceptible to being the scapegoat for everything that's wrong in society. So I do think you need those strong supporters there to message, echo the improvement and the commitment to change. It's gathering additional resources. It's filling the gap in the strategic plan. It's bringing in outside ideas and offering solutions and suggestions when people are working in isolation with what could be done differently.
So a board member about a year ago admonished us at a board meeting that sometimes you have to pour some sugar on it in regard to being that critical friend. But Dr. Vitti, for just a second, let's pretend, let's say that there was no sugar, no fructose, no honey, no sweetener, no sweet low. We have enjoyed a world whereby our organization and the district has benefited because of a strong relationship. But how might things be were there not such a strong relationship if we did suffer from a sugar outage?
Yeah. I wouldn't want a world without sugar. And not only doing the work, but in general. I just think sugar needs to be used in moderation, right? So I would apply that to this conversation. I don't think you ever, and my wife and I, my wife's an educator, and we have these debates at night, because I think she's probably my greatest critic, which is difficult. And I say, come on, you realize that I'm working here 15, 16 hours a day. This is not going to happen overnight. And she recognized that, but I bring up the point in saying that I don't think that it's helpful to always use sugar. I don't, because anytime you're dealing with the fact that we don't have a 100% graduation rate, when you have so many kids that are still reading below grade level, the conversation just can't always be about sugar. It can't, because there are kids that are falling behind, or kids that aren't being served the right way. But I think that's where the conversation starts. The conversation that starts with, why aren't all kids graduating? Why aren't all kids reading at proficiency, and what are you doing about it? And then how are you checking in throughout the year to make sure that what you say you're doing, you're actually doing, and you're having results. And when you're not, why you're not having results. And then how can we help to move that needle and have more kids read on grade level? So I'm not trying to skirt the answer. I'm trying to give an example of how you can be critiqued on not getting it exactly right, but you're forced to have the conversation about what you are doing differently, what you need to do differently, and then how that community entity can play a role in making things different. But I don't think any organization improves without an outside entity, and even internal entity, and internal people critiquing and not always using sugar. But I don't think it needs to be a balance. You can't just attack. And I think that's where a lot of outside entities get it wrong, is that if you just attack, you make the system become resistant. You isolate the system. You make the system gun-shy. And then you make the system, more than anything else, distrustful. And I always think it's important to take a step back and evaluate the leader and the leaders. So in the context of Jacksonville, and I'm not saying this because I'm sitting here right now, and I've been trying to say this, and I think a lot of people understand this, especially people that have been in Jacksonville in a long time. And again, I say, if you don't know me, I'm far from someone who's arrogant or pompous. I really believe this is true. You are never going to get another superintendent that is as engaged and is as caring and as committed and has the background and the commitment to transforming public education in Jacksonville. And I'm not tooting my own horn. You're not, because I've been out there nationally. I know what's out there, and that's what led me to want to be a superintendent. And you're not going to have a board. We have 7 board members, and is everyone completely on board to the dramatic change? No, but I think the majority are there, and we'll get there. This is the stars are aligned, and I say this to you have to know context. You have to know your community. You have to know your school district. In Jacksonville right now, the time is not to critique. The time is to build, and then shift to holding this district accountable to implementing after the building process. It would be wrong, it wouldn't be the right fit to critique now because we're building. The time to critique is a year from now. After implementation, you don't see results. Then you shift to, well, you said you're going to do X, Y, and Z. Did you do it, and why aren't you seeing the results? So now is the time to support, and I feel an overwhelming amount of support right now. In other communities, where are you at? And I think this is where Jacksonville was at. I think in Jacksonville, they were at the stage of saying, we want to do X, Y, and Z, but we don't feel like we have the right superintendent. We don't feel like we have the right board to do X, Y, and Z. And I think that led JPEF to be more in a critique, in a critical stage of reform. So where are you in your community? Do you have the right superintendent? Do you have the right school board? Is the legislature in your state supporting reform? Those are the series of questions you need to ask, and then you decide what are the next steps. I think JPEF, looking at what JPEF did, was they said, we're now organized, but the district does not see what its potential is, and it's not doing what we think it can do. You now have the leader, and again, that can sound self-serving, but you have the leader. You have the vast majority of the board is on board to the reform. So and I think JPEF has positioned itself the right way to say, now we support this new administration. We support the organization. In a year, we're going to knock on the door and say, okay, let's see the results, because we supported you for a year and a half. Where are the results and what was the breakdown? But you have to figure that out in your own community. It's never a one-size-fits-all approach with the sugar or the non-sugar. You have to know exactly where you're at institutionally with your organization.
Thank you. Do we have any questions? Any questions? All right, let's start with my friend in Philadelphia, from Philadelphia.
Yeah, Darren Schoen from Philadelphia. My question is, can you point to a couple changes in kind of policy and practice that are going to come out next year that you see as tightly aligned to the one-for-one campaign? And then of those,
sure,
are there any that you feel like would have been impossible or much harder without the political impetus of the campaign behind it?
Great question. Well, I would say some of the themes that certainly came out, and I wouldn't say that we wouldn't be able to get it done without it, but let me start with some things that certainly came out. Development of the whole child was one resounding theme, and what that meant in the context of Jacksonville and Florida, and I think every urban school district is dealing with this, is that the overemphasis on standardized testing and the loss of the electives, the loss of music and art. So that was something that I wanted to do anyway, and that I recognized was a need. But certainly the resounding feedback that schools can't just be about a standardized test, that we have to bring back music and art at the early childhood level and build that. Now we have a budget proposal that reflects that. I think we could have probably done that anyway, because I think the majority of the board members understood that that needed to be done, but it certainly makes it easier. I would say, so that was one thing that came out. I would say that the other area that came out that I think has allowed us, it given the board and myself leverage, mainly myself leverage, is the issue of governance. I think that came out with the need that the board and the superintendent has to maintain this governance structure where the superintendent is actually the CEO and is given the autonomy and the authority to run the district like a CEO, but the board holds the superintendent accountable and they work together. I think that came out a bit in the one-by-one. I'd also say, and I think this is, we've already done this, is restructuring the district. I think that through the one-by-one campaign, a lot of conversation came out about the district not being close enough to schools, that the district was more in a compliance role and not an agent of change to schools, that there wasn't solid communication between the district and schools. And I think to take that one step farther, it was also the district was not connected to the community. That the community was saying A, B, and C, but the district was saying E, F, and G, or just completely ignoring or giving lip service to A, B, and C, and not really listening at times, but not actually following through and implementing. And so, as the past 6 months, I've been able to say, well, we have to think differently about this, and it's not just me as the outsider saying this. This is coming from one-by-one in the town hall meetings and the rest.
My grandmother was left-handed, and the wonderful thing about her being left-handed is she seemed to always see things from just a slightly different perspective. And so I'm going to come to my friend here in the front And I think that you'll be able to help us in a way that perhaps we right-handed folks don't always think of. What's your name?
Watch you, my name. My name's Ross. And I'm
That's
from New Jersey.
skilled.
Ross from New Jersey.
So is there a tension that you live with around input versus buying?
Great question. And this is, and I'm not saying this because this is what you want I want you to hear this, or I want you to like me. I grew up in a home, in an immigrant home, where debate was supported. We would argue and get to the point of fighting on issues. So I grew up in a home where democracy was really alive. And I believe as superintendent, and I would believe this in any role I had as a leadership, I value input always. I really do. It makes me better as a leader. It makes me see the organization in a broader way. So I always find this, and I even find people in my organization that function like this, and I've gotten rid of some already, is that don't be afraid of critique. Don't be afraid of pushback. Don't be afraid of suggestions. This destroys public education. There are people that almost function in public education, and they have, you probably, some of you have heard of Who Moved My Cheese. Read that book or heard that book. But there are people that function and have this cup of water, and this is all they have, this cup of water, and they protect the cup of water. They don't want anyone to see it. They don't want anyone to critique it, and this is all they have. And this permeates the culture of public education. And this is why we don't grow. This is why we're not open to new ideas and change. And so, to answer your question, I see that as a fundamental deficit in public education, is that we are so averse to debate and so averse to critique. And some of it is because we've always been a whipping boy and a scapegoat of all problems in society, and people work awful hard and they don't get paid enough money. That's part of it. But part of it also is we've never consistently been efficient with our resources, with our implementation. So we should be critiqued. So I always value input. And I always feel that if the community is voicing a concern, I'm not going to say always, but I would say usually 80 to 90% of the time they're right. I'm being honest. And it's a way of trying to figure out where they're coming from and changing things. They're not always right, but they're usually right, and there's a way to get it done and bring people together to figure out the right thing to do. The problem has been in doing that is time, to really be able to communicate people the right way to explain why it's not happening, not always using email or proxies to send the message. And then sometimes it's the community itself, where the community doesn't see the broader picture and why certain things can't happen, and they translate that into, well, that's again public education, those bureaucrats, they always want to do the same thing, where there are issues that prevent you from doing everything that you want to do as well. So I hope moving forward that I've already signaled to the community, and it's about trust, is that I will always have the conversation and the debate. I will always be accessible. But hopefully there's enough trust that's built to say, if we can't do it, I'm going to explain why we can't. And hopefully you walk away by saying, you know what, we're not doing it, but I trust him. That we're not doing it because he's really being honest with why it can't happen. And then we move on. And that's how I think relationships and trust is developed. Where I've seen in the past, and let me give you this example. I made some changes at the upper level of my administration, the cabinet and number 2s and 3s. And people have asked me, even some board members have asked, how did you decide that one person wasn't the right fit in the organization? Honestly, you know what I did is that we have constituency requests that come in from parents and from community members. And usually it's about their own children. And they'll come into my email, and we have a system to where I send it to that staffer to follow up on the question. So a lot of times it was an IEP issue with special education. That's a big problem. And so that it would go to that staffer, and then what the organization was not used to is the superintendent actually reviewing the response. And it's killed me because I stay up long in the night reading all of these responses. But that's what you need to transform the organization. So I would see the response, and I would actually call the parent. And I would say, if this is what it says, is this what happened? And the parent says, no, I never got a phone call. Okay? So, or I would see the response, and I would say, it sounds bureaucratic to me. And I would bring the staffer in, and I would say, is this the best we can do? We can't go any farther on this issue. And I would get the same response. Well, this is what we've always done. Well, one thing you should learn now with this superintendent, this organization, is the word "we've always done it that way" is sacrilegious. Is don't that you're not going to keep your job by saying that. This isn't about, and so that's how you change culture. And by changing culture, hopefully that message will get through the community that this is a new day, it's a new process. So that speaks to the reform and to the frustration on my part and the community.
I think we have time for one more question.
Sure. Dr. Vitti, you mentioned reform.
Tell everybody who you are.
My name is Glenn from St. Petersburg, Florida. So you mentioned reform a couple of times. You also mentioned how your wife is a big critic. Mine is too. So my question specifically goes to the role of College of Education across the state of Florida and also nationally. How does the College of Education play or assist you in accomplishing your reform?
How should they, or?
Well, yeah, how should they?
Okay.
How should they?
Well, I think in the ideal scenario, there's a direct link between what future teachers are learning and what they're actually going to do when they're employed. And there's a significant gap between the two right now, where public education, and we're spending millions of dollars on doing this, is that we have to then fill the gaps of reality that exist once the teachers are placed. That doesn't mean that the schools of education aren't doing a decent job, but we could do much better. So concretely, the teachers that are learning to be teachers are not being exposed to the standards well enough. What are the standards? What do they look like? What are they? What are they not? How do you develop lesson plans that actually meet the standards? Okay? What is the curriculum that the district that you want to work at using for elementary reading, middle school reading, remediation math, so that you get a sense of what the curriculum looks like so that you can implement it when you start. The data system, what data is being used in order to track student achievement, and how do you get your hands on that so that you can begin to manipulate it and understand it so that you can understand how to hit the ground running with efficiencies with student performance. I think those are the key areas that we're lacking. I think here in Jacksonville we have UNF, University of North Florida, that does a good job of placing future teachers in urban schools. I think nationally that doesn't happen consistently, is that most student teachers want to go to more affluent suburban types of schools, and then you're missing that human capital possibility in the lower performing schools. So those are some suggestions. I'd also say that it doesn't take 4 years to learn how to be a teacher. Okay, meaning, so I do think you need time to learn how to be a teacher, but I think the best way to learn how to be a teacher is by doing it, just like anything. I think that there are some concepts about child development, there are concepts about race and ethnicity that you need to learn and you can be exposed to in a classroom through books for the theoretical background, the framework. But I think we need to move more of our training to support directly to practice. And then we'll have much more experienced, prepared teachers when they start to teach. I also think we need to do a better job of incentivizing our best and our brightest and undergraduate schools to become teachers, especially in STEM, in science, technology, engineering, and math. We have to do a better job of attracting someone from not being a doctor to being a teacher, not being an engineer and being a teacher, if they believe, if they can work with kids. They might not know their content, but working in kids is another dimension. But I think a lot of future engineers, doctors have that inclination, but just need to be exposed to the opportunity with the right incentive. Because if I can make $60,000 going in as an engineer versus 30, that's a big discrepancy, and that's what we have to deal with nationally, I think.
Let's give a big round of applause.